Hi everybody, welcome back. This is our second lecture on the early Italian Renaissance. We'll be looking at the middle of the 1400s in this section. As always, the names that pop out in red on that first slide are the ones to really pay special attention to. We're looking for Paolo Uccello's Battle of San Romano, Andrea del Castagno's Last Supper, and the sculptor Donatello's two pieces by him, the David and the Prophet Zuccone. And we talked a little bit already about the fact that the artists are beginning to be known by their own names, and that's really a big change from the art of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people really who made art were considered craftsmen at best. They didn't sign work for the most part. It was not considered to be the work of an individual genius any more so than the person who was carving wood to make furniture or to build your home. It was not the kind of level of fame or success or prestige that the artists of the Renaissance are going to start to receive. So the Renaissance artists from Italy in particular begin to be known often by their own names, by nicknames, or sometimes the nickname is related to the place where they were born. So for instance, today we're looking at Paolo Uccello, and Uccello's nickname indicates that he's bird-like. So we definitely have some reference here to people's physical and their demeanor, their physical appearance and demeanor. Another thing for us to be aware of is some issues of art making techniques. How are they using these materials? What materials are they using? How do you go about making art? So most of the paintings that we've looked at so far in Italy are tempera paintings. So when we say tempera, most of the time what we mean really is egg tempera. Tempera is a form of painting that is really quite ancient. People have been using this material for a really long time. It predates oil painting. And basically the pigment, what you see at the bottom left, the colored material that makes the paint have color, could be mixed with any number of different ingredients to create different paint types. It's the stuff that makes the paint stick together and makes it stick to a surface that you're painting on that changes the paint type. And we call that sticky material the medium. So with tempera, the most commonly used media is the yolk of an egg. And you can see there in the top left that the person's kind of pinching the sac of the yolk. It actually is a membrane. You can hold it, and if you pierce it or slice it, you can get just the runny yellow part to come out. And then in the big photo, you see the artist mixing that runny yellow yolk with their pigment to create paint. It definitely has an odor. It's not a great idea to use around small animals, household pets. Cats in particular will try to lick your painting off of the surface if you leave it unattended. So definitely a kind of unusual material. One of the things that I think is likely about the way that people discovered how to do this, if you've ever accidentally left yellow runny egg yolk on a plate and not washed it or rinsed it immediately, you know how hard and sticky that material becomes, how difficult it is to get off. So I don't think it took much imagination for people to realize that since it dries to this kind of clear consistency and very hard, that it would be a great way of getting paint or pigment to stick to a surface. Definitely want to reiterate the term Renaissance. Renaissance, of course, means rebirth, and for us it means the rebirth of the classical art of Greece and Rome. We also want to think about how the tempera paint is being used to make paintings on different surfaces. For the most part, we've seen painting on wooden panel up to this point, but we have seen a fair number of paintings that are murals, paintings on walls. And so when we start working in this way, one of the things that artists will do is create a diagram or a plan, so to speak, the layout, the composition of the entire painting on paper as a drawing, and we refer to those as cartoons. Now, this particular drawing that you're looking at actually is a study of the anatomy and pose for a figure for the Sistine Chapel. It's not literally a cartoon, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the artists are doing. They're finding the major shapes and lines, and once they have the laid out, the drawing or cartoon would be transferred onto the wall, and then painting could commence. So you can see the difference here from the drawing stage to the painting stage. This happens to be part of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. He quite frequently used male models even for his female subjects, and you can see that pretty clearly in this example. This shows you the entire process of fresco painting, and it is somewhat confusing to look at first glance, because really all of these steps couldn't be happening simultaneously. But if you look at it from the right to the left, you can kind of see the whole process. Here is the plaster layer being applied to the wall. This is what the artist is going to paint on. Now with fresco, the Egyptian style of doing it was to apply plaster to the wall, let it dry completely, and then paint on top of that surface. And that works well in an environment that doesn't have a huge fluctuation in temperature and humidity like the arid desert of ancient Egypt. How in Italy, with rivers and rainfall and different climate, we have an enormous change in temperature and humidity throughout the year. So instead of painting on dry plaster, which would crack and flake under the conditions of changing temperature, artists developed a technique of painting on the plaster before it was completely dry. And the Italians called that buon fresco, or true fresco. So the figure that you see at the far right here is applying the plaster to the wall. Once it becomes hard-ish but not completely dry, the cartoon, here's the drawing, is laid against the plaster, and you can see that this figure has sort of a sack, a fabric bag full of charcoal that he's slapping against the paper of the drawing, and it's creating this big black smudge. What happens there is that the drawing, prior to being put up against the wall, has a series of little pinholes pricked through it along all the major outlines and contours that the artist needs. And so this process of slapping that bag of charcoal dust against the drawing is called pouncing. And as that is slapped against the drawing, little bits of charcoal pass through those prick holes, and they embed into the plaster, and it provides a guide for the artist. You can see the result over here. This is sort of the guideline for our painter to follow. Now, obviously, we would only apply the amount of plaster that the artist that they can complete in a single session. So you would never apply quite as much as you see going on here. So kind of imagine this as one step, then this, then the painting, as if that was all being done on the same small-ish area. Generally speaking, artists would only apply as much plaster as they felt they could paint in a given session. We refer to those one day's work in English, or a giornata in Italian, and you can often see the edge between one day's work and the next. You can kind of see it here, where that white plaster line is between this figure and this unpainted section. Here's the giornata line a little more clearly. This again is a close-up of a figure from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. You can see the line right there. You can also see it pretty clearly along his back, but definitely on the outside edge of the hair. So an area that's a flat color like this could be filled in really, really quickly. You could do a much larger section if there was kind of plain work there, but an area that has this much detail and change in value would really create a lot of work in one session. Some of the artists from the late 1300s, early 1400s that we want to look at are related to the church in different ways. Now, of course, the artists that we've looked at so far in the Renaissance clearly are living in a heavily Catholic culture. They are practicing Christians themselves, of course, but it's wrong of us to think that the artists are making paintings about religious themes and making them in their own studios, hoping that someone will come and buy them just because they're inspired by those stories. In fact, in the Renaissance, what really happens is that artists receive commissions. So a client would come to you and ask for a particular subject, like the Annunciation. We've seen a couple of these subjects depicted already. Almost always, when you see an angel on the left kneeling facing a female figure in a blue gown who's seated on the right, you're undoubtedly looking at the theme of the Annunciation. And in fact, there were certain rules about how some scenes were going to be depicted, at least unwritten rules, conventions of representation. Mary, for instance, is almost always depicted in a blue robe, so that helps us to identify who the characters are in art by different artists. The artists would receive their commissions, sometimes directly from the church, but more frequently from wealthy patrons who would want to pay for decoration to go into chapels within a particular church or another location. So artists are making what the clients request, and there are certain themes that are going to come up for us again and again, the Annunciation being one, the Last Supper being another. There are actually several depictions of those same events, other than the most famous ones that you already know. This is the work of Fra Angelico, who's an artist who's definitely Catholic, definitely Christian, definitely related to the church, by the fact that he is, in fact, a friar himself. He is actually a member of the church. He's a clim. There were a couple of monks who actually became very successful painters. Now, Fra Angelico stayed part of the church for the majority of his adult life. He definitely had some freedom to be able to move throughout the city and associate with other people outside of the church, but his main function really was to create decorations for buildings that were owned by the church, to decorate things for monasteries, nunneries, etc. And that's the type of work that you see by him. These are the interior of a building that he did almost all of the painting, decorating the individual cells of the members of the church. And these are some of the paintings from that particular building in Florence. This is the convent of San Marco in Florence. Really pretty beautiful. The other most famous of the painting monks is Fraufilipolipi. Now, Lippi was definitely, in his youth, inducted into service in the church, but as he aged, he really began to kind of rebel against that vocation. And in fact, Fra Filippo fell in love with a nun, and they began an affair. Eventually, they petitioned the Pope for release from their holy vows, which the Pope actually granted them. They were able to be married, and they ended up having a son together, and he became a successful painter as well. So it's kind of fascinating to see the same subject by two different artists, knowing, especially when we're looking at Fra Filippo, that he was not only living in a monastery situation, but that he broke free from that restriction and had a more traditional relationship with other people, with a family. And it certainly shows in the way that he paints women and children. Obviously, these are blue-robed figures of Mary with the child, the Christ child. But if you look at this one in particular, this is my favorite of all of Fra Filippo Lippi's paintings. This really looks like a baby that can't quite focus its eyes yet. He's sort of playing with the hem of her garment here. He is behaving much less like a small adult and more like the way an actual baby behaves. And her face looks a little bit more like the face of a real mother as opposed to kind of a generic stock character. So you can almost see Fra Filippo Lippi's personal life in his paintings. We also can see that one of the things happening in the Renaissance is this striving for perfection. The artists are really not content to rest on their prior successes. They're always pushing and trying to do more and to become better and to make their art more and more three-dimensionally believable. And that's certainly the case with Paolo Uccello. Uccello is an artist who was almost obsessed with perspective, and you can see that here in this drawing. This is a drawing that would have been used later as a guide for a painting simply of a goblet, and you can see that he has rendered every curve, every contour in perfect perspective. It almost looks like a rendering done by scanning with a computer. It almost looks like a wireframe model from a computer-generated image. So we know that Uccello's goal, his personal goal in his art, was to achieve this kind of level of perfection in the illusion of space. He finds ways of exploring that idea even in work that is commissioned by his clients. So one of the most successful families, the ruling family, in fact, of the city of Florence throughout the Renaissance, is the Medici family. And the Medici made their money as the banking family. They were really in charge of most exchanges in monetary terms. They ran banks. They had an enormous amount of wealth themselves, and they controlled money exchanges between other family members. Uccello's painting here is part of a series that was commissioned for the palace of the Medici family, and it shows one of several scenes that are key moments in Medici's rise to power in Florence. So this one is the Battle of San Romano, which had happened in 1432. The painting was commissioned and completed in 1455, so they're looking a little bit back to their past history. The Medici then are the patrons, right? The patron is the person who requests the work and pays for it. But even though he's commissioned to do this battle scene, you can see that Uccello has figured out a way to include a way of making the work fulfill his interest in perspective. Now, we're not inside. We don't have a building. We don't have walls and straight lines to draw, if we would if we were looking at the interior of a building. But notice the figures at the bottom here. This fallen soldier, these lances and weapons have all fallen at perfect 90-degree angles to each other, which means that they line up almost like the barriers between the squares of a checkerboard. And you can see as I kind of trace them with my mouse here that all of those fallen lances point toward the same point. The center of the painting becomes the not only focal point, but the vanishing point for those leading lines or perspective lines. So it's really kind of a unique way of structuring three-dimensional space. It's kind of fascinating to think that this type of painting would have so much impact on later generations. So we know in America in the 20th century that painter who immigrated to the U.S. in the early 20th century, Achille Gorky. Gorky was absolutely fascinated with Uccello's work, but he painted in a supremely abstract way, very, very heavily non-objective. But he had reproductions of this painting. He had a poster of it in his studio. So one of the things I sometimes like to do is to take a look at it filtered through a Photoshop filter to see if we kind of blur it and take away the subject. You can see how the painting really becomes a pattern of lines, shapes, colors, and movement. And you can see that there is a sort of abstract structure underneath it, even though the image itself is ultimately representational. So even though these artists were painting very recognizable things, you can see that they would have a real impact on the art of the 20th century. This is the work of Gorky himself. So you can kind of get a sense of the structure and movement, and that limited color palette of his work is kind of similar to what you see when you really kind of break down the formal aspects of what Uccello is all about. This is the second piece in Uccello's series of the Battle of San Romano. This is the defeat of the Sienese commander. So the city of Siena and the city of Florence are in conflict. My favorite aspect of this one really is kind of remarkable, the way these horses have fallen over. So we get these beautiful foreshortened limbs on their legs. We see directly into space, as if they're coming in and out of space toward us, the way this horse is kicking his legs, the way this face is foreshortened on this horse, the whole is foreshortened here. Really is a great example of a use of perspective. This is the final panel. This one is the counterattack. So this is really chasing the enemy out of the city of Florence. We also want to take a look at a type of painting that's very typical in Italian Renaissance. We refer to it as the Sacra Conversazione, or the sacred conversation. We've already seen a couple examples of this. Generally, what you're seeing is not a depiction of a scene or story from either Old Testament or New Testament. In fact, the characters, if you will, the people in the paintings, oftentimes didn't even live during the same years. Sometimes they come from different centuries and different cultures. So it's not a literal depiction of a biblical story. Instead, what you're seeing more often than not, you might have patrons, the people who paid for it, on the outermost edges or at the bottom of the painting. In this case, we have saints. Francis, John the Baptist, Saint Zenobius, and Saint Lucy, all of whom here are venerating the Madonna and Child. So the idea is that the sacred conversation is almost like an idealized vision of heaven itself. And so in heaven, these dead, martyred saints return to the forms that they had in life. They are very often dressed in specific ways so that we can recognize who they are. John the Baptist is pretty easy to recognize by his clothing from the wilderness. And then, of course, the figures of the Holy Family can appear as they were in their lives, and most frequently in Italian painting, the Christ figure, rather than appearing as a grown adult man in these paintings, appears in the guise of the baby, the child in the arms of the Queen of Heaven, Mary. So we have this tradition of altarpiece painting that really is rather unique. It's not showing us literal biblical storytelling or narrative. It's an opportunity for the patron to select saints that are important to them, perhaps the saint who is the saint who's honored on the day that they were born or has some other connection to their family history. It's a way of kind of making a connection between yourself and heaven in a very direct way. It's also kind of an interesting opportunity for an artist to kind of imagine what a heavenly environment might look like. This is the work of Andrea del Castagno, and Castagno is nicknamed for his hometown. He was at one point believed to have been involved in a murder of another artist, which is absolutely impossible because Castagno actually died before the artist that he supposedly killed. So it was a really miscommunication in translation of art history, which is kind of funny. But Castagno was definitely known for his images of biblical characters, and particularly this image of David. Now, when you think of David in the Renaissance, you probably think of Michelangelo's statue, which is of a much older, more muscular and nude figure. But most of the depictions of David in the early Renaissance in Florence really emphasize the actual more literal, direct interpretation of the story. David's actually quite young when he has this confrontation with the giant Goliath. And most of the time he's depicted in a very youthful form. Now, this painting is on a shield. A lot of artists did do work on objects that were practical or were intended for practical use to some degree, but by the virtue of the beauty of the painting, of course, they've elevated this useful object to another category. Castagno is also really well known for this painting, his idea or his interpretation of the Last Supper. Now, as I said earlier, a lot of artists painted the same subjects. So there are plenty of other artists who will create versions of the Last Supper, and obviously this is the one that you're familiar with by Leonardo da Vinci. One of the typical conventions in the depiction of the Last Supper in most early Renaissance paintings is that it's very, very easy to tell Judas apart from everyone else. And I'm sure you can pick him out quite easily yourself right now. He's the only one that nobody wants to sit next to. He's the one on this side of the table with us, isolated from all of the other disciples. Kind of an interesting case. We definitely wanted to take a quick look at the work of Piero della Francesca. Piero della Francesca was definitely a successful artist in the early 1400s, and he created this remarkable altarpiece for a misericordia, a society of mercy. You can almost imagine them as functioning somewhat like our emergency services EMS does today. There's a figure here venerating the Holy Mother that's wearing a dark hood, and he is not actually an executioner, as you might think. He, in fact, is a member of this Misericordia. He is the one who would be in charge of helping to remove bodies of the dead. So if someone died at home from plague or what have you, there would be this kind of ceremonial removal of the body and this need for kind of dignity and anonymity on the part of the person doing that work. Piero della Francesca, also much like Uccello, is really intrigued by the use of perspective, and you can see here that by setting the flagellation of Christ in a somewhat indoor setting, we get a really good view using the lines in between the tiles here of how that one-point perspective really works. There's a good overlay that shows you where the focal point, or the vanishing point rather, would be. The line that you see here in blue is your horizon line. That translates essentially to your eye level. And then anything that would be parallel to that is going to retreat toward the same vanishing point on the horizon line. So Piero della Francesca is really well known for these narrative paintings, biblical subjects, and this kind of attention to clear storytelling that you'll see in a lot of his works, including his version of the Annunciation and the resurrection of Christ. He's coming out of the tomb in this image. Certainly he created a fair number of sacred conversation paintings, including this one for the Duke of Urbino. And again, he is the patron. This is the Duke right here in armor. And it's interesting, if you look at the majority of sacred conversation paintings, they're very, very symmetrical. So if we do a center line vertically, then there does seem to be something missing here to balance out the Duke. And in fact, his wife should be there on the opposite side. She had died right before the painting was completed, so he was left on his own as he's the living person, kind of praying to this and having this group of saints and the mother and child sort of as a holy vision. You also sometimes see this symbol in sacred conversation paintings. There's an egg hanging from a golden chain over Mary's head. It's an ostrich egg, and strangely enough, that egg symbol is really meant to symbolize the virgin birth. And if you think about it, I suppose the egg is laid by the bird, but the bird doesn't give live birth. So it sort of relates to Mary's remaining a virgin after giving birth to Christ. Piero della Francesca's painting in this example here is a pair, or a diptych, of the Duke and his bride. Now, she had unfortunately lost her life very young, and so the speculation is that this could have been painted from her death mask. It was not uncommon to a plaster mask and then wax replicas of people's faces right after they died to be able to kind of preserve their image. But you can see some pretty typical Renaissance features here. The Duchess has her hairline plucked back really far from where most women's hairlines would really be. More than likely the hairline would be somewhere here. So it's been plucked and shaved backward, which seems odd to us. But of course, we do lots of things in the name of fashion that the people of the Renaissance would find very strange. The idea was to show more forehead, to actually create the illusion that you're of a little bit higher class, and especially to emphasize the idea that you're more intelligent. So that shaved brow, or shaved hairline rather, is to indicate her knowledge and her intelligence. You'll notice also that the face of the Duke seems a little bit strange. There seems to be something kind of missing here, and in fact there is. He's sort of missing a section of the bridge of his nose, and in fact he's not only missing that, but also the eye on the other side of his face that we can't see in this position. You'll only ever see the Duke from this angle. He had lost his eye in a joust, and so he's almost always depicted from this particular point of view. But it's important in Renaissance painting that people look the way they did in real life. So artists are not overly glamorizing people. They're not photoshopping flaws, so to speak, right? If you're a little heavy, they're not going to make you look thinner. If you have warts and boils, those are going to be in the painting. If you're missing part of your nose, that will come out in the painting as well. You can see a little bit clearer in this close-up shot. And these are the backs of the paintings. So you actually see them being carried on these gorgeous carriages to their wedding. There you go. That brings us to the work of Donatello. Donatello is perhaps the most important early Renaissance sculptor other than Ghiberti. Now, if you know your Ninja Turtles, you know the name Donatello. All of the other Ninja Turtles, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, are all high Renaissance. The peak of their careers comes later. Donatello is an early Renaissance artist. His career peaks much earlier, so he's really kind of out of sequence. Donatello was a master of all of the sculptural forms that were available during the Renaissance. He was a master stone carver, master wood carver, and a master at bronze casting. So the image of his to know on this slide is his image of the David. And again, it's kind of odd when you think of Michelangelo's version, white marble, older, muscular, more adult. This image is clearly more similar to what we've seen so far, the images of David that represent him as a much younger person. It's also not a terribly dramatic image, although it does obviously relate to the work that we saw from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. You can see there's a very dramatic contrapost. The hips have a definite angle, one leg's engaged, one is loose, and he's got sort of the opposite angle in his shoulders from the angle in the hips. So he's got that S curve that we associate with the styles and proportional ideas from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But the image itself is very much after the fact. It's not the most dramatic part of the story. In fact, you can see the decapitated head of the giant is already under his foot there. He's holding the rock that he used with the sling to bring the giant down. But there's really no question here about whether or not he's going to succeed. And that's a very big difference. When we look at Michelangelo's sculpture, you'll notice that there isn't a head of the defeated enemy. The sculpture by Michelangelo happens, or depicts a moment rather, before the conflict, which is really pretty remarkable. When you look up close at the images, this is Mary Magdalene and this is St. George. When you look at these figures, you really see the mastery of carving that Donatello is able to achieve. He can replicate textures of hair, skin, wrinkles, fabric, metal in almost any material. It's really quite a remarkable talent. This gives you another chance to take a look at David from more than one angle. It's always interesting to me to take a look at sculpture not just from the one ideal point of view that's in your textbook, but to try to imagine how the sculpture would look fully in the round, because you really would be able to move all the way around these figures. Donatello was also quite gifted at relief sculpture. This is cast bronze relief. And he did a number of pieces for the campanile, the bell tower at the Florence Cathedral. And so the bell tower has niches, these sort of semicircular depressions in the wall, decorated with all kinds of fancy architectural details, but they would house sculptural statue forms. So this is his sculpture of St. Mark, and the one to know for the test is the prophet Zuccone, also known as Habakkuk. You can definitely see in these figures that they're a little bit less detailed than the ones that you would see up close, because these would have been mounted into these niches on the wall. You would see them from below. So Zuccone is actually kind of a nickname, loosely translates to English as skinhead, because he has this kind of big hairless dome for a head, and his head's a little bit too big for his body, which is sort of logical, of course, because that part would be much further away from you if you're looking up at him from the ground. So there's a little bit of distortion there. You can see these figures in their niches right here. So you're looking at something that's really like 3 stories above you. There's the height of an average human being right on the street there. So it gives you a sense of how tall the bell tower actually is. This is the Florence Cathedral. The photograph is taken from the dome looking backward, and the baptistry would be in front of us over here outside of the frame of the photo. Okay.